So now let's talk about the multiplication of vectors. Now there are two types of multiplication that you can talk about. One of them is the scalar multiplication, that is you multiply a vector by scalar. Multiply by scalar, let's write that down. And then you multiply vector by a vector. Okay, so multiplication by a scalar and multiplication of a vector by a vector. And multiplication by a vector is again of two types. One is the scalar multiplication, that is known as the dot product, and one is the vector multiplication, that is known as the cross product. So the scalar multiplication of two vectors produces a scalar, and the vector multiplication of two vectors produces a vector. But first we are going to deal with this thing, that is multiplying a vector by a scalar. Then we are going to jump into this variety and explore these two topics in detail. Okay. So multiplication of a vector by a scalar, multiplication of a vector by a scalar. So this simply scales the length of the vector or the magnitude of the vector. So if you multiply a vector, let's say a, by a scalar, let's say m, then m into a is simply m times magnitude of a into a cap. Okay, that simply means that the length of the vector or the magnitude of vector is altered or scaled m times. The direction of the vector a, which is given by a cap, remains the same. So for instance, if you have a force, let's say of 10 newtons towards the right, okay, this is a very nice way of specifying a direction right now, but let us say that you have a force of 10 newtons towards the right. Then if you multiply this force by, let us say 5, then 5F is 50 newton force towards the right. Okay, I'm going to keep the right in double inverted commas because right is not a way, right is not the right way to specify the direction, if you will. So that is the example. So basically you see the magnitude of the force got altered, the direction remained same, and that is pretty much the idea. If you multiply a vector by a negative number, let us say minus 5 units, minus 5F is minus 50 newtons to the right, and minus 50 newtons to the right is the same as 50 newtons to the left. Okay, so that is something that you need to understand or develop an understanding of, that minus of any force reverts the direction, but reverses the direction only by 180 degrees. You cannot revert the direction by, let us say, an angle of 45 degrees. By scalar multiplication you can only change the direction 180 degrees. So if you have a force towards the left, you can multiply that force by -1 and move it towards the right. Point it towards the right. If you have a vector towards the right, you can multiply it by -1 and make it point towards the left. And if you want to change the direction by 180 degrees, as well as you want to change the magnitude, then you have to multiply by your desired magnitude and the negative sign. Okay, so that was all about multiplication of a vector by a scalar. This is not much of a brain buffer. So that is pretty much as I was telling you, that is pretty much the concept of multiplication by scalar. And as I told you, that is not very much of a brain buffer, so you can simply practice 2 or 3 examples and just get done with it. Now we move on to the concept of multiplication of a vector by another vector.